Hi there, and thank you for taking the time to watch this short training video. This session today is called From Triggers to Teaching, Replacing Behaviour with Skills. In the last presentation, Invisible Triggers, we looked at what sits beneath the surface of behaviour and how understanding function helps us make sense of what we see. In this session today, we are going to take that understanding just a step further. My aim for this training is simple. I want you to leave with a clearer sense of how to move from managing behaviour in the moment to teaching the skills that prevent those moments from happening in the first place. By the end of this video, you should feel more confident recognizing when behaviour is communicating a need, identifying what skill might replace it, and knowing how to teach that skill in a way that actually works. The overall goal is to shift our thinking from stopping behaviour to teaching behaviour. We are not just reducing what we do not want to see, we are increasing what we do want to see by teaching skills that make challenging moments less likely. Before we get into the practical side of things, I want to pause for a moment on a shift that's been happening in how we talk about behaviour. It's a really positive change, and it's shaping the way many of us think about and respond to the individuals that we support. So let's start here with how our language shapes the way we think about behaviour. You will notice throughout this presentation that I will be saying behaviour that challenges rather than challenging behaviour. And that change is deliberate. It reflects how our language in this field has evolved. We have moved away from describing the child or the individual you are supporting as the problem and towards describing the behaviour as something that challenges us. If you look at the comparison on the slide, you can see how a simple shift in wording changes the message entirely. It is not just about semantics, it changes the lens we use to interpret the behaviour. It might sound like a small difference, but it really changes how we see things. It takes the focus off the person and puts it back on what is happening around them, and that's for things such as the environment, the triggers, the interaction, or even the unmet need. And what I really like about that shift is that it immediately makes the work more compassionate, which is the very important element for behaviour analysts, but also for all of us who work with children and young people or adults who need our support. Instead of asking what is wrong with this person, we start asking what is happening for them right now. And that one change in question can completely change how we respond as professionals. When you think about it, the language we use reflects our mindset. If we speak about behaviour as communication, we approach it more likely with curiosity rather than control. Now, when we think about behaviour that challenges, it is easier to fall into the habit of trying to stop it. But behaviour doesn't just stop. When one behaviour fades, something else will take its place. The question is, what will that be? Our job is to guide what comes next. Behaviour support is not about punishment or suppression. It is about helping the person find a better, safer, and more effective way to meet their need. There's a paper I really like by Carr and Duran from 1985. Whilst I know that it's nearly 40 years old now, it is still such a valuable piece of work. And they found that when individuals were taught simple communication skills that met the same need as their behaviour that challenges, the behaviour dropped significantly and stayed low. If you're interested, I have linked the paper in the resource section in this presentation for you to have a look at after the session. It's definitely worth a read. Now that we have set the foundation, let's think about why teaching replacement skills matters so much in practice. So this slide focuses on the real reason we teach replacement skills. Every behaviour serves a purpose, and if we remove a behaviour without offering an alternative, we leave a gap, and that gap will always be filled. Replacement skills close that gap by allowing the person to meet their needs safely and appropriately. And you can see that illustrated on the slide. That bridge metaphor between the two cliffs represents exactly that. Teaching is what connects the gap between problem behaviour and the appropriate alternatives. For example, someone who shouts to gain attention can be taught to ask for help. A person who may refuse a task to escape a demand can be taught to request a short break. And when the new skill is easier and more effective than the old one, the behaviour that challenges begins to fade away. It's really interesting to see how powerful this approach can be, and in several school-based studies when individuals were taught alternative communication skills, reductions in behaviour that challenges were often above 80% within a few weeks. You can see measurable change quite quickly when the approach is right. So instead of asking how we can stop behaviour, the better question is what we can teach that meets the same function in a much more positive and safer way. And that leads us perfectly into our next focus, which is on understanding the function behind behaviour before we teach anything new. Before we can teach anything effectively, we have to be really clear on one thing, and that is why the behaviour is happening in the first place. Ask yourself, what is the person gaining or avoiding through this behaviour? Is it attention, escape, access to something that they want, or sensory feedback that helps them regulate? If you look at the table on the slide, you can see those four functions side by side, and that's attention, escape, tangible, and sensory, and those are the core of every behaviour that we see. Once we know the function, we can match it with the right replacement skill. If a behaviour is maintained by attention, the new skill must also get attention. If the behaviour helps someone escape a demand, the new skill must provide a more appropriate way to request a break or ask for help. I remember reading a paper by Horner and colleagues that looked at positive behaviour support in schools. And it was really interesting because they found that when teams designed interventions directly linked to behavioural function, outcomes improved not just for the individual but across the entire environment. I've added a link to a summary of that research in the resource section. It is a good one to revisit if you want to strengthen your understanding of function-based support. Now that we have thought about how function guides teaching, let's look at how we can actually teach those new skills in a way that works. This slide is about how we actually teach replacement behaviour once we know its function. And teaching replacement behaviour is a structured, deliberate, and a consistent process. Firstly, we need to identify what we want the person to do instead. The skill has to be achievable for them right now and not something that's several steps ahead. Then we need to teach it explicitly using methods that fit how that individual learns best. And that can involve methods such as modelling, prompting, using visuals, or practicing in roleplay. If you look at the process on the slide, you can see that cycle of identify, teach, and reinforce. It is simple, but it's powerful. And when you use it consistently, you start to see real and sustained progress. Reinforcement is what keeps the learning going, and the new skill must be reinforced every time it appears so the person experiences success. If asking for help brings positive attention and quick support, it will always be repeated. There's an interesting fact here, and that's when reinforcement happens within just a few seconds of the desired behaviour, learning can occur nearly twice as fast. Timing really matters because it helps the individual connect what they did with what happened next. I often think back to the early work of B.F. Skinner, who demonstrated how reinforcement shapes learning through experience. And in our context, we use that same principle compassionately to build independence and not just compliance. And if you would like a practical resource that breaks this process down further, you can find a short guide on teaching replacement skills linked in the resource section below this video. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what this can look like in a real world situation. So let's look at a practical example and think through how this would work in everyday life. Let's imagine someone who becomes upset most evenings when asked to turn off a game and come to dinner. On the surface, it looks like refusal or defiance, but when we observe it more closely, there is a clear pattern. It tends to happen after long periods of focus or stimulation, and it is linked to difficulty switching attention and sensory overload. The behaviour allows them to avoid that transition and regain a sense of control. And the image on the slide captures that contrast between the two worlds, the calm of the game and the sudden demand of dinner time, and that tension is often where the behaviour begins. If we looked at this through a surface lens, we might label it as oppositional, but as behaviour analysts, we look at it as functionality. We ask, what is this behaviour achieving, and what skill might be missing that would help this individual meet the same need in a better way? In this case, the function might be escape or avoidance, but the underlying need is predictability and control during transitions. So we begin designing a teaching approach that addresses both. We model and prompt the person to use a simple communication skill like saying, "Can I finish this level first?" The adult would then respond positively, provide a short extension, and then guide the transition calmly. What's really important here is how the skill is taught. It is not introduced in the heat of the moment. We would actually start by practicing it when the person is calm, maybe even role-playing the routine together. The key skill is pairing that skill with success every time they use it, so they experience control and predictability and the interaction ends positively. And over time, the door slamming fades not because we punished it, but because we replaced it with something that achieves the same outcome, but in a more appropriate and safer way. And this approach is explored beautifully in several case studies on the Autism Focused Intervention Resources website, which I've linked below if you would like to see real examples of this process in action. So as we move forward, I want us to now talk about the key ingredients that make teaching like this work consistently across different situations. This next part focuses on the core components that make replacement teaching successful. Timing matters because we teach when the person is calm and able to learn, not in the middle of an escalation or episode of dysregulation. Relevance matters because the skill has to make sense for the person and it has to fit the context of their daily life. Consistency matters because everyone who supports that individual should recognise and reinforce the new skill in the same way. Predictability is what will then build trust with that individual. And lastly, reinforcement matters because the new skill has to work. If it achieves the person's goal more easily than the old behaviour, it will replace it naturally. And you can see those 4 pillars that I've just spoken about on the slide, and together they make the foundation for any effective teaching plan. And when even one is missing, things start to become shaky. But when they're all in place, learning becomes stable and generalisable. So with those foundations in mind, I want us to widen our focus and think about how this kind of teaching supports long-term development, not just the immediate behaviour change. Now, this slide takes us beyond the here and now. Teaching replacement behaviour is not just about managing incidents, it is about helping people to build independence and emotional understanding over time. For many of the children and adults that we support, especially those with learning disabilities or limited communication, this process can look a little different. It often requires slower pacing, more structure, and consistent teaching across various settings. And we might need to use visuals, gestures, or assistive technology to make communication possible. The key thing here is that the skill that we teach has to be meaningful for that individual. For someone with a learning disability, that might mean breaking a skill down into smaller, teachable steps or practicing it in a real-life situation until it feels natural for them. This is also where our ethical responsibilities come in. We are not teaching behaviour for our own convenience. We are teaching skills that promote dignity, choice, and autonomy. And that is especially important when we work with people who rely on others for support or whose behaviour has often been misunderstood. I remember reading a paper by Frank Grisham from 1983 where he talked about social validity, and he explained that what we teach should have real-world meaning and add genuine value to the person's life. I've included that reference in the resource list because it's a great reminder of why our work has to stay person-centred and meaningful. So when we look at replacement behaviour through this lens, it stops being a short-term fix and becomes a long-term investment in a person's well-being and their independence. And when we start to see it that way, it brings everything that we have talked about together and leads us naturally into our final section. So let's pull everything that we've covered together now. When we move from triggers to teaching, our entire approach to behaviour changes. We start to see behaviour as a skill gap rather than a problem. Every behaviour that challenges becomes an opportunity for us to teach something new. Our job as professionals is to identify the missing skill, teach it clearly, and create an environment where using that skill works better than the old behaviour ever did. If you look at the flow on the slide, you can see how that shift happens, from managing behaviour to understanding function to teaching new skills. It is a simple visual, but it really captures the mindset change that we have been talking about in this presentation. And when we do this consistently, homes, classrooms, and support settings become calmer, relationships improve, and behaviour change becomes something that lasts. This is what good behaviour support really means. It is not about managing behaviour, but about teaching new ways to communicate, to cope, and to connect. And as we wrap up this session, I want us to reflect briefly on what this means for us as practitioners in day-to-day life. As we finish, I want us to remind ourselves that every behaviour communicates a need. Our role is to understand that message and teach a safer, more effective way to express it. When we take the time to understand function, respond with empathy, and teach meaningful skills, we're not just managing the moments, we are shaping growth in the individuals that we support. You can see the puzzle image on the slide, and that really sums up the message that's being made here. Understanding, teaching, reinforcement, and growth are all parts of the same picture, and when they fit together, everything starts to make sense. As promised, these are the resources I have referenced in some of the slides. Please feel free to explore them if they are of any interest or benefit to you. And if you have any questions about anything that was covered in this video, please feel free to drop me an email. I'm always happy to discuss ideas, help you think through examples from your own settings, or share additional resources that might support your practice. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.